Next month, Spider-Man No Way Home debuts in theaters, and it looks to be the biggest film of the pandemic era. Now, I'm a massive Spider-Man fan, as I assume you are too, but I've never reviewed the Raimi trilogy of films or The Amazing Spider-Man. So leading up to No Way Home, I'm going back and reviewing all of those old Spider-Man films that I haven't talked about in detail up to this point in time. This is week number 2, so we're talking about Spider-Man 2. Let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your take on Spider-Man 2. This is a spoiler review, so feel free to spoil away down below in the comments section. My take isn't the right take, it's just my take, and I would love to see yours. Also, I've done a ton of Spider-Man content in the past. You can check it up in these two playlists. One of the playlists is my Spider-Man reviews, and the other one is my Spider-Man rankings, editorials, pitches, all that fun stuff. You can check them out right up here when this video is over, and let's get started with the good. And right off the bat, this movie does what all great sequels do, and what I mean by that is that it continues both the story and the themes of the previous film. On a story level, this picks up about 2 years after the first film, but thematically, we are seeing the logical next step. The first movie ends with Peter fully embracing the fact that with great power comes great responsibility, and part of that responsibility for him, to keep the people that he loves safe, he has to keep them a little bit at a distance, so he rejects Mary Jane's love for him, though it breaks his heart. This movie picks up immediately with Peter struggling, trying to balance being Peter Parker and being Spider-Man, and all the responsibilities, all the directions he's being pulled, it's taking a toll on him immediately. And this movie is all about that struggle of him trying to be both Peter Parker and Spider-Man and fulfilling all the responsibilities for each of those identities that he carries. And because of that, I think that this is the most thematically focused of all the Spider-Man films that we have up to this point in time. It knows exactly the idea that is being explored, and it runs that throughout the entire story. The main conflict when it comes to the action is Doc Ock, but the undercurrent for Peter Parker is, can he be both Peter Parker and Spider-Man? Can he accept that? Is he okay with that? What does that look like? And throughout the whole movie, it just keeps putting conflicts in his way. He struggles to keep a job. Therefore, he struggles to make money. Aunt May is also struggling to have enough money. He, of course, wants to be Spider-Man and be the hero, but being the hero means that he can't be with the woman that he loves, and the woman that he loves, because he has rejected her, has found someone else. And so just on all these different levels, on everything that he values, there's a conflict in his life because he is Spider-Man. And that's at the core of what makes Spider-Man interesting, is all the how relatable he is. Most of us have not been bitten by a radioactive spider. Most of us have not gained spider powers. And most of us also don't live in New York City, though some of you do. But we can relate to the fact that it's really difficult to juggle all our responsibilities, to try and be the best person that we can be on all these different fronts. And they find a way to tell a story that's so fantastical, it's so fun, and at its core, Peter Parker is just a normal guy with the same struggles that we have. Just the cause of them is a little bit more fantastic or amazing or spectacular than the cause for that same exact conflict in my life. And so I think that's so much of why a lot of people think this is the best Spider-Man movie. And a lot of people praise it as one of the best comic book movies of all time, is because it manages to have an exciting Spider-Man adventure with a great villain. We'll get to that in just a little bit. It has awesome action. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it has a heart, and it feels relatable because it's so thematically clear and such a perfect next step from where the first movie ended. This one picks up, and immediately it makes sense. You understand why he has this struggle. That's what would happen if you were the Peter Parker from the first movie just about 2 years later. And all the tension about Peter being pulled between these two different roles and consistently having to reject MJ, even though he of course loves her. She knows that he loves her, so she doesn't know what's going on, why he keeps pushing her away. And because of this journey all throughout the middle of the film where he's like, yeah, I can have you in my life. No, I can't have you in my life. That back and forth. And even when she's with her fiancé in this film, clearly she's looking for an excuse to get back with Peter. And you just feel that tension. Therefore, when you get into the climax of this film, where she's been kidnapped, where Doc Ock is off to go and stop the device, Peter turns around and they have this shot where all of it is revealed. MJ sees Peter's face and she doesn't need to say anything. The look on her face says all that needs to be said about this moment, how she's feeling. And it's the payoff of 2 movies of character development, relationship development, and conflicts between them. This is the payoff of this, the resolution to it, where the answers are provided, and it just pays off so well. It's so satisfying just to see the look on her face as she realizes, why is the person that I love been pushing me away for so long? Oh, he's both the other people I love. He's Peter Parker and he's Spider-Man. He's the hero that keeps saving me. He's my best friend. And there's a reason why he's treating me the way that he has for so long. And you just see it all in her eyes as it makes sense. Moving right along, we've got a great villain in this film with Doc Ock. And one of the things that the Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man's rogue gallery in general, in the comics, in the cartoons, in the movies, is that makes them so great is that they're, generally speaking, not just sociopaths that want to do evil things. They themselves have a certain relatability in what they're doing. So at its core, he is a scientist that's trying to advance things. He's got some ego in there. He's a little bit reckless, but we even spend time with him before he's turned into Doc Ock and realize he's a romantic at heart. He has a wife, and he's a decent guy that has Peter Parker over for dinner and chats him up a little bit. You see that positive side to him. So then when the monster emerges, when the accident happens and the robotic tech is taking over his brain, we see the transition. We see the contrast between who he was and what he turns into. And we see also how the monster is, if you took the humanity out, if you took all the filters out, if you took decency, compassion out of who Octavius was, then you get this mad scientist that just thinks that anything's worth the cost for the experiment to advance science. That is one of his value sets, but it's not his only value set when the humanity is in there. So when the humanity's gone, you're able to have this really sick version of him that's willing to kill people, do unbelievably dangerous experiments for the sake of science, growth, the next experiment. Likewise, that means that when we get into the finale, the reason that it can have so much emotional weight is that we're rooting for him. He didn't become the monster because of a horrible character flaw or because he was selfish or because maybe he was a little reckless, but he wasn't driven by something evil. He was driven by ambition. Something terrible happened. So you want him to have that redemptive arc, and you want him to rediscover his humanity. So when you get into the third act and they've had a little bit of fighting between Spider-Man and him, and he gets knocked down, the ultimate way that the threat is neutralized is through Peter Parker pulling his humanity back out of him.
It was my dream.
Sometimes, to do what's right, we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most.
Knocking his senses back into him, so he decides, I'm going to control the arms aren't going to control me, and it gets back to the guy at the beginning who's a decent guy, no, I have to do it. I'm not going to die, monster. I created this threat. Of course it has to meet me. I need to stop this experiment. And that's profound because it's a redemptive arc for a character that deserves one. There's characters that are evil and like, no, that guy's beyond redemption. You don't want that person to be forgiven. Then there's characters like him that it's a tragic story of a science experiment gone wrong that's led to dire consequences, and the person responsible for that owns that, and he wants to take the steps to do the right thing and put in the threat and uses himself in that regards. Next thing that really works great about this film is that it's only 2 years later since the first movie came out. So it's actually a quick turnaround, which is kudos to them for being able to do a 2-year turnaround and turn out a great film. But technologically, it feels like there's some pretty big leaps here. And some of that is when you do the first movie, you're figuring out how to do it. Once you've figured out how to do it, it's much more easy to replicate it, and it's also much easier to expand upon it and do more interesting things. And so it feels like several of the action sequences here just have a much bigger scope and size to them. There's more of Spider-Man swinging throughout the city, where it doesn't feel like that's gonna feel a little bit limited in the first film, like when it was groundbreaking that we got to see any of that. But here it's just kind of smoothly transitioned pretty frequently throughout the film. You get these big sequences where it feels like we are swinging through New York City. We're on a train in New York City, and you feel the size of the city, and without it looking like we're just on a set or doing rear projection, it starts to become lifelike while seeing truly fantastic things in a gigantic environment. And once again, this is the sort of thing that if you were born in the 21st century, movies have always been able to do this in your lifetime. If you're born around 1990, if you're born in the early 80s like me, you remember when you couldn't do things like this with these environments this large, this realistic. If you tried to do it, it was a very obvious effect where there's like a screen behind them and like that you're just looking at a cheesy effect. And here, that train sequence on so many levels was groundbreaking because it's so massive in what it's able to accomplish. Speaking of that train sequence, to me, this is probably the best action sequence in any of the Spider-Man movies. Like, there's ones that have some cooler effects. The Mysterio fight with the illusions and everything, that's an amazing sequence. But when I say it's the best action sequence in any of the Spider-Man movies, I think it just hits on so many levels in regards to being a great action sequence. Because right off the bat, it's groundbreaking in what they were to do in the scope size, as I've been just been talking about. But then adding to that, it also is so pivotal to Peter Parker's journey in the film, where he had just rejected the role of Spider-Man for the middle chunk of the film, and he's decided, I'm going to put everything on the line because that is what I need to do. This is who I am. It embraces that destiny. And then you have this sequence where this train's out of control, and he's so desperately attempting to stop it, and it's done in such a great way to where you can just see how much he's exerting effort to stop this thing. Where just scenes earlier, we'd seen him watch a mugging take place and ignored it. And this is how much he's grown and changed and embraced his true destiny as Spider-Man. So that's part of it. It's just that the weight of everything he's doing, so much so that he exerts so much energy that he passes out, and he's taken his mask off. And one of the things I love about both the Raimi and Amazing Spider-Man films is that they very much treat New York City as a character in the film. The people of the city have a very distinct cultural identity, where if you mess with one person from the city, you mess with all of them. And so repeatedly all throughout all 5 of these films is that you have these moments where Spider-Man's in trouble and the city steps in to protect him. And so after he passes out, they carry him down, and you have this moment where he immediately goes, oh no, I've been exposed. They've revealed who I am. I'm going to be in so much trouble over this. And you see the panic in his eyes. And everyone on the bus is like, it's okay.
It's all right.
We won't tell nobody.
You're our hero. You don't need to worry. And they walk up and give him his mask, and it like you see him just calm down of like they've got my back. I'm not all alone. I feel alone because no one knows my identity, but I'm not alone. The city is on my side. I just love that that's kind of how that plays out in these movies in multiple ways. And I think this is the best example of it, but in all of them, even when The Amazing Spider-Man, the cheesy scene where they're moving the cranes, even when it's cheesy, I still think it works in these movies. And little side note, I've been critical of No Way Home and my expectations for it. I'm sure it'll be fun. But even in the concept of the film, when you have New York City turn on him, that sits a little bit wrong with me. Because it's one of the things I've enjoyed about previous Spider-Man films is that the city didn't turn on him, that they had his back. And even more so, the Spider-Man that saved the Earth after the battles, multiple battles with Thanos, them turning on him, that doesn't sit quite right with me. Back to Spider-Man 2. So they have his back, Doc Ock returns, and Spider-Man's catching his breath, he's getting up. And even though it's a villain with big robotic arms that just, can fight Spider-Man on his own, everyone says, if you want to get to him, you got to go through all of us.
You want to get to him, you got to go through me.
And me.
Me too.
And everyone on the bus stands in front of Peter to try and save him from Doc Ock, even though they have no chance of being successful in their efforts to save him. So Doc goes, well, whatever, smashes them off to the side. And all the ingredients in this sequence just work for me of great action, groundbreaking action, emotion, Spider-Man embracing his destiny, the role of New York City as a character in and of itself that has his back. And that's exactly what he needs. After this journey that he's been on of like, man, how do I balance all of this? Does anyone care? Do I matter to anyone? Am I all alone? And they're like, we'll never tell anyone. We've got your back. I think it's just a great, phenomenal sequence in the film. But really, the movie, all the action here is really good. This is an example of a franchise where they were just on a hot streak and knew what they were doing. And all the energy that went into the first film is back here. And in certain ways improves on elements of the original film. And a lot of you would easily say that this movie is better than the first one. A few other things to talk about in here. There's a lot of just nice little details all throughout the film that have become iconic. Like the rent guy. The nasty, mean landlord. This is a trope of all movies that people have financial trouble and the landlord shows up trying to get rent. But normally you just forget who that person is. Except in Spider-Man 2, where the guy becomes a meme 20 years later. Rent. And it's just so memorable. And then his daughter that seems to like Peter Parker, and she's super, awkward in her own right in the way that she behaves. Just those little details that make the moment stand out. Peter Parker shows up late to MJ's performance. Of course, you got Bruce Campbell in his mandatory Sam Raimi film cameo as the guy blocking him. And it's written in a way that just pops. It's fun. It has a lightness to it while also representing something very painful for Peter Parker, that he failed her once again and he can't let her know why. Also, every time I rewatch this movie, it's just interesting how many familiar faces just kind of show up in little roles all throughout the film. Joel McHale shows up as the bank person.
Oh, that boy of yours is a real hero.
The pizza lady at the beginning is the star of Bones, Zooey Deschanel's sister. There's just a lot of those people that just kind of show up little roles here and there inside of the film. Also love that dashboard confessional song over the credits, Vindicated. Still a great one whenever I'm driving in my car by myself, throw that one on, and all of a sudden I'm singing very loudly right along with Chris Carrabba. So all in all, a rock-solid Spider-Man movie that in a lot of ways improves upon Spider-Man 2002. Certainly, it continues that film's story, its themes, builds upon it, so it's a great expansion. I do have some very distinct problems with Spider-Man 2, though, so let's move on to the bad. And what holds this movie back for me is I simply have never been able to fully buy into the fact that Peter Parker would just lose his superpowers because he's bummed out about being Spider-Man. Now, I understand. He truly has deep regret over what's happening. I understand there's scientific literature and examples of people having these sorts of situations take place where they lose certain abilities over a cognitive hindrance to them. But there's certain types of plot points that feel like screenwriter trickery. And this is one of them. It's very difficult to pull off having someone that has a specific set of superpowers where you show us he has little hooks on his fingers, you show us that he has super strength, you show us that he has an organic web slingers in his wrists, and then because of trauma, suddenly the hooks on his fingers don't work anymore. There's a gap in that doesn't hold up, like there's still hooks there. And that's the issue to me, that I like the gap for me to buy into that specific thing to work that's so pivotal to the plot of the film, that he's lost his powers. He doesn't have them because he doesn't want to be Spider-Man anymore, therefore it doesn't work. And he really, really is struggling with all of this, therefore he's losing his powers. It's just the type of thing that never really works all that well for me in movies like this. Like, to buy into the premise of Spider-Man, you have to be able to go, okay, I'm okay with the idea that if a spider is exposed to radiation and bites someone, they'll gain superpowers. So that's a big, gigantic leap that I have to take to be able to enjoy this movie. But you can only make so many of those before the audience starts being like, really? Can you just write anything you want? Whatever needs to happen to get the story right along is what you allow. And we all have different points in time, different things that feels like, that's a little bit too much. You're asking too much of me that all of these things are happening that have led to this moment in time. So that he both was bit by a radioactive spider that gave him powers, and that there's a Doc Ock who just happened to design an AI that when the chip gets snapped, it roots back into his brain and takes over him. So I have to buy into that too. And I have to buy into that Peter Parker got so depressed that this super rare thing happened that made the hooks in his fingers stop working. So you get to a point in time where you start having too many of those things in a row that it just doesn't click. That every movie, for us to have an exciting story, you have to have something that's highly improbable. There's something that's fantastical in almost every story for us to go along with it. There's some gigantic leap to make us buy into it. But when you keep asking me to leap, at some point in time I say, I'm not quite there with you anymore. And Spider-Man losing his powers is one of those ones for me with this movie that I just, obviously for a lot of you it works, but for me it doesn't. It's too big of a leap. It's one too many asks of me as an audience member to buy into the fact that this could just happen and go along with it for something that, like, I get it, there's some medical research that something like this can happen. That doesn't mean that it's not unbelievably rare for it to happen. Other issue here is that the movie repeats stuff from the first movie. And this is true of all three of the Raimi films, that there keep being these scientists that decide with a good heart or good intentions, at least, some amount of, they're not trying to be a mad scientist. They're not trying to turn themselves into a villain. They're not driven by, I want to go and destroy things. The starting point was trying to advance science. They experiment on themselves. The experiment drives them mad. They have close personal ties to Peter Parker, and in the end of the movie, they kidnap MJ, and Peter has to rescue him. Repeats some story beats from the first movie, and then the third one does the same thing once again. And some of that's tricky because that's inherently a little bit what's the Spider-Man mythology, the comics, is that it's kind of closely tied like that, and that does happen a lot in the comics. But that doesn't mean you have to repeat the same beats in the exact same way like that in each of your movies. And of all the ways, creativity in these films, all the ways that themes were strong, advanced technology, great sequences, great moments, it also repeated some stuff that I wish that it I've maybe found a different way to do some of that. So fairly minor criticism, but it is there for me. Real quick before I give you my final score on this one, remember to join me down below in the comments section. Let me know, what did you think about Spider-Man 2? I know a bunch of you absolutely love this film, think it's one of the best comic book movies of all time, even better than Spider-Man 2002. And I just have a few issues with it, though I love the film too. Also remember, I still have a bunch of other Spider-Man content. Got my Spider-Man reviews as well as my Spider-Man rankings, editorials. I did one last week that made a few people not so happy with me about my expectations for No Way Home. So you can check those out right up here when this video is over. Overall, this is a great follow-up to Spider-Man 2002. It continues the story, it expands the themes, and it's one of the more focused Spider-Man films that we have ever gotten. And there's just this one plot point in the middle of it that has never really sat quite right with me, and a few repeated plot points that knock it back just a little bit while still being a great Spider-Man film. Overall, it's an A- on the entertainment scale, a 9 out of 10, and this is a must-watch for Spider-Man and comic book movie fans. If you enjoyed this video, remember I've got more like it right over there. We got my other Spider-Man reviews right there. Right down there, we have my Spider-Man rankings and editorials. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.